Hello beautiful people, welcome back to the Civil War Wild West edition, and we are here for part 3 of our analysis of Hispanic Confederates by John O'Donnell Rosales. This is a directory of every known Hispanic soldier and militiaman in the Confederate armed forces and the wider war machine of the various state and territorial governments. So let's just jump right back into the text. At the end of part 2, we left off with him briefly talking about some of the Sephardic Jews who were expelled from Spain and who ended up in the New World as refugees and exiles. So, getting back into the text. There are 5 other specific groups represented in the listings. The first are the mulattoes of Spanish African ancestry who had acculturated as Hispanics and in many cases were slave owners themselves or tied to the southern cultural and social status quo by business, land ownership, or other ties. And it looks like they were concentrated around Pensacola, Florida, St. Augustine, Florida, and Mobile County, Alabama. They consider themselves Creoles of color. And he mentions the Louisiana Native Guards. We mentioned them in part 2 of our series on Black Confederates on this channel. The second group were the mestizos of Spanish and Native American ancestry who joined many of the Texas regular and militia units. These units were composed of white and mestizo Hispanics, almost all of Mexican descent, white Americans, or a combination. These men were almost all from Texas, and most were born in Mexico or Texas when the area was Mexican territory, or when Texas was an independent nation prior to joining the United States, with a few from the Confederate territory of Arizona. And just so you guys know, in a moment we're going to be hearing from a Mexican-American Confederate veteran in his own words. The third group included Asian men from the Philippines, which was a Spanish colony until 1898, very true, who had settled in the New Orleans, Louisiana area and then spread to other Gulf Coast states. There were a handful of them in the Confederate forces. There are a few photographs that survive, which show them to be of Filipino or Filipino-Spanish mixture and not white Hispanic ancestry. These few men might be the reason that Chinese are mentioned as being part of the Louisiana Zouaves. Oh, that's interesting. And of course, back in the day, some uninformed Anglo-American just sees some Asians and they say, oh, okay, well, he must be Chinese. It makes sense why they would think that way. The fourth group, the Minorcans of Florida, were composed of Minorcans from the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean Sea who spoke a dialect of Catalan as well as, in many cases, Spanish. They intermarried with many of the Italians, Corsicans, and Greeks. The fifth group, the white Spaniards, other than the Sephardics, Isleños, and Minorcans, could be broken down into 3 subgroups. The first were the old Creole settlers who had lived in many of the previous Spanish possessions in the southern United States and had stayed on after Spain lost these areas. The second subgroup were immigrants from the former Spanish colonies, among them Mexican revolutionaries, and those fleeing the upheavals in Mexico, which had its own civil war at the time of the American Civil War, who settled in New Orleans, Louisiana, as well as from the then Spanish colonies of Cuba and Puerto Rico, or as some of the folks from the island say, Puerto Rico. In the second subgroup were many Cubans who emigrated into Louisiana and Florida, and many on the island who had strong business ties with one or all of the Gulf states. And I believe he mentioned earlier, O'Donnell Rosales mentioned earlier that his ancestor was a Cuban from the island who served in the Florida forces, I believe, in the Confederate Army. Oh, this is interesting. A good example of the mutual affection that existed between Cubans and the Confederacy can be shown by the gesture of all the ladies of Matanzas, Cuba, who presented a first national Confederate flag made of silk and colored red and gold, colors of the Spanish national flag, to the captain of the blockade runner steamer Gordon, later named Theodora, which ran the blockade from Charleston, South Carolina, into Cuba. The original flag survived the war and is presently in the Confederate Museum of Charleston, South Carolina. The exact number of... alright, now this is important. The exact number of Hispanics in the Confederate military will never be definitely known, as many Hispanic women married into other ethnic groups doddering out their Hispanic surnames. The book lists over 6,175 men. If you estimate the dotted out surnames, the total number who actually served could lie between a low of 8,000 to 10,000 men to a high of approximately 10,000 to 12,000 men. I have based my listing on those men I was able to find to be of Hispanic descent. So Well, there's an answer to the question that we were asking in part 1. Were there really 5,000 Hispanic Confederates? It looks like we have a confirmed 6,175, although the 8 to 12,000 number, low of 8,000, high of 12,000, I can agree with that. And as far as the dottering out of Hispanic surnames, I don't have any concrete examples from the American Civil War off the top of my head. But as far as military history, the first example that comes to mind is Reginald B. Barclay, who was a World War I soldier. He was killed in the war and posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. And he had an Anglo-American surname because his father was Anglo-American and his mother was, I believe, a Mexican-born immigrant. So his full name was Reginald B. Cantu Barclay, and when he enlisted, they just dropped his Hispanic surname. Also, I am a modern-day example of that. My name is Zach Foster. My mother's maiden name is, whereas my last name is Anglo-American. So I am a Mexican-American. I speak Spanish fluently, but you wouldn't know it from the looks of me exactly, because I look like Dracula, or I look like a conquistador, actually. Just put me in an armor suit, you know, with the pointy helmet, and put me on a horse, and this is exactly what a conquistador looks like in the 1500s. So yeah, that makes sense. I could agree with the 8 to 12,000 number. The study of the contribution of Hispanics to the total Confederate military effort will, I hope, open the way for researchers, historians, genealogists, and anthropologists to one day truly present the forgotten history of the Hispanic Confederate soldiers, sailors, medical, and other designated personnel. There is a wealth of information contained in the following pages. I hope it adds to the rich history of our nation. I would agree that there is a wealth of information here. But Mr. O'Donnell Rosales has a very rosy view of the Confederacy, and I get that. He's really hyped up that he's got a Confederate ancestor who was, you know, Cuban like himself, from the island like himself, and then who immigrated to the United States. I can see him identifying very strongly with that. However, you gotta dig into the experiences of actual Hispanic men who served in the Confederate Army. So we have here the memoirs of Reverend Santiago Tafolla, who was a Tejano, ethnic Mexican born and raised in Texas. And Tafolla is mentioned. He is named in this directory. I did find him, and he enlisted in the Confederate Army with an Anglo first name and his Mexican last name. So he's listed as James Tafolla, and James is Santiago in English, or Santiago is James in Spanish. Which one of those two languages is older? I don't know. I'll have to get back to you. Actually, we can just do a Google search right now. Is English or Spanish older? Spanish in the US. Well, Spanish predated English in arriving in what is now the United States. Alright, cool, but which European language is older? Okay, so according to Autolingual, it looks like Old Spanish became a thing around the year 900, whereas Middle English, so Canterbury Tales type English, was born around the 1060s. Okay, so then if Spanish is the slightly older language, then that means James is Santiago in English, not the other way around. Hey! Alright, now before I read you what I'm about to read you from Reverend Tafolla, this Confederate veteran's own words, I want to add some context here. He has a lot of very positive memories of Anglo-Americans and Anglo-Texans. There are many Anglos in this book over the years, but also during the Civil War, whom he describes to be his friends, including Anglo fellow soldiers. However, there was an ongoing problem in the Confederate Armed Forces, which was rampant, absolutely rampant. So let's read this one and a half page excerpt, but it's very powerful. Please hear this out. This is a Hispanic Mexican-American Confederate veteran in his own words. And by the way, this manuscript that I'm reading you, it was translated from Spanish. I'm reading it to you in English, but he wrote this in Spanish. At that point, General B felt it would be best to send to San Antonio some of the Yankee prisoners taken the same night Judge Davis had been captured. For context, there was a lot of cross-border raids and skirmishing between Yankees and Confederates in northern Mexico, so that's what he's referencing. I ended up being one of those chosen to be part of the escort. We arrived at San Antonio after delivering the prisoners. I got permission to visit my family, which was at my ranch in Bandera County. When we returned, we found the regiment already at Santa Gertrudis, a place better known as King's Ranch. The Yankee army had disembarked at Baghdad, and the Confederate army had retreated from the Rio Grande and was marching towards Corpus Christi. The day we arrived back to the regiment, I was surrounded by my Mexicano friends, who were still left in the regiment, as many had already deserted. They begged me to word a petition to Colonel Duff asking that we be transferred to the regiment of Colonel Santos Benavides, who was in charge of a regiment of Mexicanos in the service of the Confederate States. Because during my absence, Corporal Juan Mercado had disappeared from one day to the next, and it was believed that he had been hanged. We had in our regiment a group of about 10 men who had the bad reputation of hanging folks, and it was said that they had hanged several men who didn't go along with their ideas. Among these hangmen, there was a captain named Taylor who they said had a grudge against Corporal Mercado and had threatened to hang him. He made his threat in the presence of one of Corporal Mercado's friends, a man named Juan Santa Anna. Santa Anna told Corporal Mercado about the threat. Since Mercado had disappeared so suddenly, the boys believed he had been hanged. It was for this reason that the Mexicanos wanted to be transferred to Benavides' regiment. They feared for their lives in our own regiment, for at every step there were constant and ugly disagreements between the Mexicanos and the Americanos. The colonel, however, denied our petition, telling us that we were mistaken. He assured us that Corporal Mercado had not been hanged. Mexican ancestry it inspired a lot of the Hispanic Texans, the Tejano Confederates, to simply desert because they did not want to visit those abuses on people from their own ethnic group. So overall, I believe John O'Donnell Rosales paints a very rosy picture of the Confederacy. I disagree with that. It's just inconsistent with what the primary sources tell us over and over and over again. However, the actual work of doing the research and compiling the names in this roster is absolutely incredible. This is the 3rd edition. I don't know how many editions total that there have been, but Rosales did outstanding research in that regard. So my hat is off to him for that. And he made a comment about multiple Hispanics serving in the Arizona Confederate Forces. I scoured this directory and I only found one Hispanic last name in the entire Arizona Cavalry Battalion. There were Mexican-American forces in the Arizona Brigade, but remember, those were not Mexican Arizonans, they were Tejano. They were recruited from Texas. There was only one Mexican Arizonan or Mexican immigrant residing in Arizona who was recruited into the Arizona Cavalry Battalion before they got kicked out of Arizona Territory in the summer of 1862. So that concludes our look at Hispanic Confederates by John O'Donnell Rosales. There's a lot of excellent information in this book that could probably inspire further research. And if you haven't already seen it, check out my recent video on Civil War locations in downtown Los Angeles. I had a lot of fun making that one and filming on location. And you can listen to me tell a story about the Confederate guerrilla war that happened in Northern California in 1864. It is an incredible story, and it is a true story. And I know I've held it off, but I promise the book, The Confederate Territory of Arizona, which has even more information than I had time to put in the documentary, will be out and available in the Amazon Kindle store very soon. I will continue to update you on that. Also, remember, please hit like and subscribe because it really helps out this channel. Thank you very much for watching the Civil War.